Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Marie Kulbeth. I'm the general counsel here at SixFifty. SixFifty is a technology company. We're a subsidiary of Wilson Sonsini, which is a large international law firm. What we do at SixFifty is we automate the law and we make it easier for companies to engage with the law and to fulfill their compliance needs. We do that in a number of spaces. Today, we're going to be focusing on employment law issues. And to help me do that, like I said, I'm the general counsel, but I'm going to have an amazing team joining me today. We have with us Adrian Jack, Adam Wright, and Ryan Parker. Adam, Adrian, and Ryan are part of the dream team at SixFifty that has created our employment law solutions. So we're going to focus on their expertise quite a bit today. One of the things that we have created here at SixFifty is a 50-state employment handbook solution. Adrian and Adam have both been heavily involved in creating that. We also have a new tool that's going to be coming out soon that Adrian's been sort of the mastermind behind. And that one will help you know, as you hire employees in new states, what legal needs you may have in those new states to hire your employees. So she's been head down on that for the last little while. We're excited to have her with us on this webinar. And Ryan sort of is the one behind all of it. He is our chief legal product officer here at SixFifty. And so he's got his hand in on all of our products. So a little bit about each of them. We are today a group of lawyers. We will try not to be too boring. And our job at SixFifty is to take out the legalese. So we'll try not to make it all about the legalese. I was just talking with them about what I'd say to introduce them. Instead of focusing on their amazing, outstanding academic credentials, oddly, they all went to law school in Michigan. We've got Michigan, we've got Northwestern, and I'm like the loner here from Utah. So
I'm in Chicago, but it's close.
Chicago.
It's a sister city.
It's right there.
It's
sorry.
So close. All the Midwest.
I got the name of the school right. I got the name of the school right. My bad. It's because Adam's bio was popping up next to your name earlier, Adrian.
I am trying to be Adam.
But we do have a few fun facts about this team. Adam, although he lives in New Mexico, he's the only employee that we have who I know of who has ski in, ski out at his home. I don't know how that works in New Mexico, but talk to Adam. Adrian is the Star Wars nerd of the group, according to Ryan, at least. She's she's laughing because she knows what I'm about to say. Ryan claims that she named her baby after a Star Wars character because the baby was born on May the 4th. There's some dispute in the Jack household about that. And Ryan is the proud parent of some French chefs. His children are Francophiles, and every time that I seem to talk to him, they have prepared him some new dish. I wish I were working from Ryan's house. So that's our team. With that, let's talk about today's agenda. So we will get the slides going for everybody. Today will be a slide light day because we want to make sure that we focus on sort of the back and forth of the content. But what we'll be talking about is the policies that a company needs for their remote or hybrid workforce. We'll be talking about legal considerations to take into account when you're entering into employment agreements with those remote or hybrid workers. And we will also be talking a lot kind of throughout the webinar today about how to maintain your culture with that dispersed workforce. So a lot of these legal needs overlap with what might be going on with diversity and inclusion at your companies. So we'll be touching on that as part of our discussion today. With that, I'm going to talk first with Adrian. Adrian is, like I said, she's sort of the architect of a new solution that we have that's looking at, what to do as you move your workforce to a remote or hybrid situation. With the pandemic going on, that's pushed a lot of companies to move in this direction more quickly than might otherwise have been on their roadmaps. And other companies are trying to decide, like, okay, are we going back into the office? Are we going to maintain some sort of hybrid situation? Are we going to actually stay full remote? This is a conversation we've been having at our company. Our customers have all been having it. And so it's really timely, but it also is really complicated. And so I'm going to start off by turning the time over to Adrian to sort of introduce us to, what are some of the legal requirements that we need to think about as we're building these dispersed workforces, what needs to go into your remote work policies. And, as you build those policies, how might that look different in some of the different states?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. I'm excited to be on. And I would not declare myself a Star Wars nerd, though I have watched many Star Wars films, but that's not really my jam. So when it comes to remote employees, there are kind of two main policies that determine how remote working and employee relocation work. So a remote working policy is typically a policy that addresses when and how employees can work remotely. So what that looks like, and then when they're permitted to do that. And a remote working policy typically communicates several different things. It communicates the eligibility requirements for when employees can work remotely, whether they need to obtain permission to work remotely, whether they need to provide notice, a certain amount of notice in advance that they will be working remotely, or whether it's fully in the employee's discretion when and how to work remotely. But also a remote working policy should address the remote work expectations. And this is a big one that we've seen a lot of companies thinking about is, okay, we've addressed when employees can work remotely, but what are our expectations around that? And a clear policy is really helpful to address employee questions on this point and can really reduce the time that the company is spending going back and forth with employees answering questions or communicating this if they have a clear policy on the point. And when it comes to remote working expectations, this can mean things like, are there certain days that employees are expected to be in the office? So if the company has a position like employees need to be in the office 2 days a week, does that mean they must be in on Monday and can be in any other day? Or what does that look like for the company? And we've seen as companies are finally returning into the office, it seems like after many dates that have been scheduled and pushed back due to COVID and its variants, we're finally seeing a lot of companies returning to the office to the extent that they plan to do so. And I've been watching closely some of the technology companies and what their positions are, because I think that's a good indicator for what are these big companies doing as they may be market leaders in this space. So we've seen that Apple is starting to require employees to go into the office. They're doing kind of a 3-phase plan. And the first phase is that employees have to go in the office 1 day a week starting April 4th, and then 2 days a week after that. And then starting May 23rd is kind of the final phase of their plan where employees have to be in the office 3 days a week. And that's Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So they have set days that employees have to be in the week. And then the other 2 days are flexible work days. Google similarly has announced it requires employees to be in the office at least 3 days a week. And that's starting April 4th. And then Facebook is delaying their return until March 28th. They previously had a January date that got pushed back. And then some employees can request to work remotely indefinitely. So we're seeing companies take kind of mixed approaches to this, whether it's 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week. Some companies have scheduled days, others do not. That's important for companies to think about and clearly communicate to employees so they know what's expected. As well as what are the hours that employees are expected to work? Are they expected to respond to things within a certain time period? As remote working is becoming more common, that also gives employees flexibility, which is really great to balance the other things in their lives. But also, it's helpful for the company to communicate if they're expected to be in front of their computer or doing their work between certain hours, like maybe core working hours, the company should communicate that. And maybe they can build flexibility around the edges, but what hours and response time is expected should be included in that kind of policy to help employees understand and have a successful remote working experience.
I love that you point that out, Adrienne. It's one of the things that, I've actually seen in my work as general counsel, which is that, in addition to just having the policy, understanding the contours of what the policy means and helping communicate that. This goes to that culture note that I said would kind of come in throughout today's webinar. Having a policy that tells your employees when they're expected to be at work, whether they're working from home or from the office, like when are you expected to be there and when can you rely on your colleagues to be there, right? Because, we have a remote policy here at SixFifty. And, what we've learned is, because we're a dispersed workforce, we're coast to coast, California, Ryan's over there in Maryland. We have to understand like, okay, what is our work day now? Our work day, we have corporate headquarters in one state and one time zone. When can you rely on your team members to be present? And when should you not rely on them to be present? When should you not be scheduling meetings because it's unfair to colleagues who may be in a different place? There's a lot that's built into there that can help build inclusivity by taking into account, like, where are your employees now? If you used to all be in one time zone and close together and now you're not, you might need to think about creating some new flexibility, not just the flexibility to work from home, but to have different hours than you might have had previously.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. That is absolutely something to think about, is what are the time zones that you're even operating in, because that might affect your core working hours. And then to follow on to a remote work policy, which takes into account kind of temporary or where employees are near a workplace and go in periodically. There's also the other side of that, which is an employee relocation policy for employees that maybe aren't expected to be in the workplace as frequently or at all. They may want to relocate to a new location that they can have a different lifestyle that they prefer. And so we're going to turn to that relocation policy. But first, we'd like to poll you on, our first poll is, how does your company approach remote working? We'd love to know whether you require employees to get approval before working remotely. And we'll bring up that poll, or if employees have to indicate to their supervisor or somebody else in the company what their remote working schedule is, or if they have to be in the office certain days, or if they can have full discretion to determine when to work remotely, or if your company doesn't have a set formal policy on this point. So please go ahead and vote on how your company approaches remote working. Okay, we'll give that another, let's do another 5 seconds, and then we'll close that poll. And I'm interested to see, I've seen a lot of news reports about how some big companies are doing, and I'm interested what attendees on this call are, how they're approaching this. Okay, let's go ahead and show those results. Okay, interesting. So the biggest one is companies have no policy on this point. A third of companies have no policy. And it is kind of a thorny area where companies had to adjust quickly during the start of the pandemic and maybe haven't decided where they want to land permanently. But it is helpful to have that communication for employees. And then a quarter of them allow employees to determine when to work remotely, which is interesting. So we're seeing a lot of flexibility for companies that are on this call, which is probably great for a lot of employees. Awesome. Thank you so much for doing that. And then we're going to dive into employee relocation policies. And this is one that has driven the new tool that Marie has talked about, where we're seeing a lot of companies, as they become remote first or remote only, that employees can live really in a variety of places that they couldn't before. And this allows employees to relocate permanently, but this has a lot of implications for a company that companies need to think about beforehand, so that when employees ask or request this or go ahead and do it, what that means for the company. And so the new tool that we're working on addresses this and gives companies an overview of, okay, if you have an employee that wants to relocate to Nebraska, for example, and you've never had an employee in Nebraska, here's what that's going to look like for you. And there are employment registration requirements, like states require employers to register as a foreign employer in that state, which may mean they need a registered agent there. They might need to register and report that employee to the Department of Labor as a new hire. In fact, all states require that in some form. There are also tax implications, which is a big one for companies. I think that's often a driving factor in when companies allow employees to relocate. The tax implications can be, if a state does or does not have an income tax, the employer has to withhold employee wages in that state and remit them to the state, which requires a registration process. There can be unemployment insurance contributions in that state, as well as workers' comp that meets the requirements in that state. Some of them allow a policy to just be included that a company already has, but in some states, a company has to contribute to that state worker compensation fund. So there are a lot of different tax and money implications for a company, as well as different employment policies that may be implicated. Some states require extensive paid leave, and employers have to contribute to that. Or they have vacation policies that require a certain number of days or payout if an employee terminates of that vacation, as well as notice requirements, confidentiality requirements, and signage that has to be posted to the employees. These are all things that a company needs to think about. And so as companies grapple with all of these implications, they need to decide, okay, how and when do we allow employees to relocate? Do they need to provide notice to us that they're relocating, and how much notice do we need? Or do they need to get permission from the company, written permission from HR, from somebody within the company to relocate? Or do we have a certain number of states that we're already meeting the requirements in, and we say, okay, these states are pre-approved, you can relocate to these list of states, but then others you need to get permission or provide notice. And then think about, what are the consequences if an employee relocates and hasn't provided notice to the company? So we'll bring up our next poll quickly, and we would love to know what requirements do you have for an employee to relocate? Do you require pre-approval from the company? Do you require notice from individuals? Do you pre-approve states? Do you do some combination? Do you have a different approach, or do you have no set policy on employee relocation? And this means permanent relocation, not like a temporary remote working arrangement. But if an employee wants to move their domicile to a different state, how do you go about that? Okay, let's give you another 3 seconds and then we'll close that poll.
I'm really interested in this one because I had to go through this decision at the beginning of COVID with our employees.
Yeah,
so
let's bring up those results and see. Oh, interesting. Okay, so almost half companies have no set policy on this point. That is surprising to me because there are so many implications for the company. I think it can really become complicated if a company doesn't know or isn't aware in advance of where employees are relocating. So about half have no set policy, and then a quarter require pre-approval. And from companies that we've talked with, we see pre-approval as kind of the dominating requirement because it is such a big decision for the company. And Marie, what has been your experience with this?
Yeah, my experience is you better have gotten permission. For us, it's a policy requirement. So when an employee asks me, I would like to move, this is where I want to go to, the first thing that I do is I check to see if we're already in that state. Because if we're already operating in there, that's easy. So I actually haven't set a pre-approved list of states for our employees. Part of the reason being we have some employees in states where certain numbers of employees in those states will subject us to new restrictions. And so while we did hire there, these are people that we actually hired there, we're not encouraging people to move to those states because we don't want to be subject to these additional restrictions. Right. So I don't want to put out a list and people are like, oh, sweet, I can move to California, no problem. Because yeah, I could do it, but I don't want to encourage people to go there if it's going to make my life harder.
Yeah.
That's my personal take on that.
Yeah.
But we've decided not to set a specific list, but to say you have to get approval. There's certain things we're going to check on the states that you want to go to before we decide. And we try to be really flexible with it. Thus far, we haven't at our company denied any of those requests. But we need enough lead time to be able to get ready. So for example, we had an employee who moved from Maryland. Ryan used to have somebody he could go to lunch with, but moved west and is now in one of the Western states. And when that employee made that request, I had enough lead time to go to, put the proper notice in with the state to register as an out-of-state entity that was going to be an employer, all the tax issues and to get ready, right? Because the problem is when you can't get ready and you're trying to fix things after the fact, when say you've been doing the wrong withholding because you thought they were in state A and they're in state B and that kind of thing. So to me, having a policy in place is really important because if you don't have a policy, you won't know the things to do in the proper order. Your employees may move, and then you're in the position of having to decide what to do if they've gone to a place where you're not ready to do business. Yeah. It could also subject you to sales tax in some states where you don't have sales tax responsibilities otherwise. And so again, you might be messing up not just on their withholding, but on your own taxes as a business. So it can create a lot of problems. Yeah. I have talked with customers of ours that have let employees go because they moved to a new state without getting permission, and the company couldn't do business in that state. They weren't ready to do it. And, it was treated as a violation of the employment agreement. Because also the employment agreements that you have with your employees, and Adam will talk about this in more depth, they might become void if they move to a state where some of the agreements that you have in place are not allowed. And we'll talk about that in regards to NDAs and non-solicitation agreements. But, there might be things that you have placed a high importance on as a company that you wouldn't be able to continue to do if you move to some of these new states. So to me, having a policy is very important, and then communicating that policy, which you've already touched on the importance of that. Yeah. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
Quick question for Marie here. How do you decide? So when you have an employee that wants to relocate to a new state, as general counsel, how do you figure out whether that's a state where you want an employee to be, right? It seems like such an overwhelming task to try to figure out, okay, what's the non-compete law in this state? What's the registration requirements in this state? How do you wrap your head around that?
Well, that's a setup for me being excited about the tool that Adrian's been creating. I'm very excited to be able to use that instead of doing my own research. I have to do research. So, I start typically with the website for the state that they want to move to, with the employment website. I look at the requirements for, a new employer. I'll start there. I'll pull in our finance office and have them check on what it would mean for sales tax, if it has any implications on that side for us. So there's different teams that I have to pull in at our business while we make the decision. So I don't make it by myself, but I'm in charge of like leading out on pulling together all the right information. So, we gather the information, we do the research, we check it with finance, and then we talk about, okay, overall, like also budgetarily, will this increase our costs? If it will increase our costs, is it going to be a budget problem? So we have that conversation. Those are all that's all the quantitative side of the decision. There's also the qualitative side, which is the question of, we want to be an employer where employees want to stay with us because we've been good to them. And so there's that qualitative factor where maybe some of the quantitative factors push against letting the employee move, but we want to do what we can to support them. And so we then have to go through that more nuanced balancing act of, if we do this, can we support other employees if they want to go there too? Would we be able to be equitable about it? And that's where I think it can be hard, because a quantitative, you can go to X, Y, and Z states, nowhere else. That's really easy to uphold, right? But when you're making these decisions, like if you don't have a policy in place that will give you the factors you have to check and balance against, then you're in a place where, you might accidentally be treating employees disparately because you're not thinking about all the same issues every time. So I have a checklist I have to go through. I have to go through the full checklist. And then if it's close, we're going to decide in favor of letting the employee go where they want to go. If it's not close, then it's easy.
And Maria, I think you've touched on this a little bit, but it's interesting. We've talked about some of the burdens that fall on a company when they have employees move to new states. But we did have an interesting comment in the chat that with, the tight labor market that we have, allowing employees to move to new states has some advantages, and that it may allow you to keep employees that you wouldn't otherwise be able to keep. And it may allow you then to recruit new employees in those states. And so there are some real advantages to being able to recruit talent more widely, especially if you're a remote first company or a company that allows people to work remotely. And so there are really, there's some weighing that needs to happen, right? As you're thinking about sort of the effort that goes into having employees in new states. And I know a lot of that for our company falls on you, Marie, but also the benefit of keeping employees happy, keeping them at your company, and maybe being able to recruit new employees in new states.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to kind of some of the things Adrian's been touching on with, remote work generally and relocation. It's hard for an employee to see why you would say no, right? Like, I work remotely. Why do you care where I'm working from? It doesn't make a difference. So if you're going to have to tell an employee no, I think it's very important to be very transparent about why, because maybe there's some other solution that you could work out. Maybe the move that they're getting ready to make is for some reasons where you could, create some additional flexibility for that employee so they could take care of the personal reasons that were making them want to relocate. There could be other things you could do. And so I think legal and HR need to be very closely working together on these issues.
Totally agree. I think we can, I could talk about remote working the whole webinar because there's so many interesting nuances, but we wanted to talk about some of the other types of policies companies need to think about with a remote workforce. And so Ryan is going to jump into those and talk about a few other concerns with remote working employees.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. We thought we'd start with a video conferencing policy. And I actually want to start by launching a poll to just ask how many of our attendees have a written video conferencing policy. It's interesting. I would guess that people in almost every company are doing more video conferencing than they certainly did in the past. And we kind of want to know whether you have a written policy, because as we'll talk about in a moment, there are a lot of different aspects to video conferencing that can be clarified in a policy. And I'll go through some of those in a minute. So this is an easy poll. It's just a yes or a no. We'll give you another minute or two, but I'm interested to see how many companies actually have a written video conferencing policy that sort of sets out their expectations for when their employees are video chatting for work. And why don't we wrap that up here and see what our results show. Interesting. 88% saying they do not have a video conferencing policy. I'm a little surprised the number's that high. I wouldn't say super surprised. I think this is kind of a new issue, but it's interesting as you think about what could be in a video conferencing policy. As Marie mentioned, we have an employee handbook and we have a video conferencing policy that we offer an engine to help create one. And it has a lot of different parts. One is what platforms you support. And I know this is a headache for me. Sometimes we partner with a lot of different groups and we meet with different groups and we use Zoom and they use WebEx or GoToMeeting or Skype or Slack or, there's so many different platforms. Do you have certain platforms that you support? And especially if you're having meetings where there could be sharing of confidential information or the like, I know that some companies are very sensitive about which platform they use. Another thing is video backgrounds. You'll notice that Adam, Adrian, Marie, and I have different video backgrounds. These are ones that our marketing department put together for SixFifty. But we also sometimes have fun, interesting backgrounds that we use jokingly in team meetings. I have one where I'm sitting at the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon. That actually probably should be Adrian's background, but no. Adam and I joke. I also have one where I'm sitting in the big house, Michigan's football stadium. But there are different backgrounds, and a lot of companies actually have come to us and said, "Hey, we need a policy on backgrounds because we want to make sure it's professional, and we want all of our employees to use backgrounds so that they don't have people walking behind them in their calls, and they're not kind of showing their homes." And so that's an interesting part that can be in a video conferencing policy. There also in our policy, we have some points of about recording video calls. And this is an important one because I think sometimes people want to record so they can take notes, but it's important that everyone understands that it's being recorded and that you're all on the same page and that you have a policy for how those are used after a video conferencing call, how long they're stored, those kind of things. We also, in our video conferencing policy, have a few points of etiquette about eating or drinking or doing other things on video calls. And finally, we have a section on dress code. We've actually had a surprising number of companies say, "Hey, we're having some issues where people, because they're working at home, are not dressing professionally. And when they're representing the company on calls with other companies, we want them to look professional and to represent the company in a way that we feel comfortable with on video calls." And so those are the types of issues that you can put into a video conferencing policy. Some companies, though, may also think, we want our employees to use sort of their best judgment and we trust them with important things. So, Marie, how do you balance sort of this idea of, do we want to lay everything out in a written policy, or do we want to kind of let employees use their judgment? I mean, how would you kind of balance a decision like that when determining whether to have a written policy?
Yeah, well, as general counsel, I always lean in favor of a written policy, but we're also at a young, fun company. I would say our culture at SixFifty is fun, which is very appealing to our workforce. It's like, like you get together with your team in the morning and you have a morning call where we have like some strictly water cooler time on the video call, where it's like, oh, what'd you do over the weekend? Was it fun? Did you like get outside? Did Adam go skiing again? Nice. But, so like we want to cultivate, workplace friendships and all of that so that we can work well together as teams. But at the same time, things that work really well when you're small, because, there's not a lot of differentiation, right? You all kind of grew up together in the company. So you all know how the company works and how we do things. That changes as you grow. And it also changes as you rely more and more on video conferencing, which I think the majority of companies now are doing. Especially with remote and relocation options. And so I would say, having a written policy in place is definitely the best approach. But within that written policy, you can build some flexibility, which you sort of touched on, Ryan, which is, you can have your policies that are required for when you're on calls where there are non-company people present. And you could like maybe be more flexible on company calls. So, the fun backgrounds are okay on team calls, but if we have, a client or a customer or vendor on the call, we're not going to do our super fun backgrounds. We're going to do our official company backgrounds. So you could build some flexibility into your policies and give people the ability to make some of those judgments, but also at the same time create like a cohesive company culture and brand. because now that we're doing the majority of our meetings that build our brand through video conferencing, it really is important to think about, what is our company culture? What are we projecting? In addition to sort of legal requirements. And I love that you touched on recording, because now platforms have sort of caught up with where we are. And if somebody presses the record button, your attendees will be notified on the majority of platforms and they can agree. And that is like my favorite thing that's ever happened on any platform that I've used, because I'm a privacy person and I'm like, hey, trying to teach my employees and always train my employees about like requirements for consent to recording. It never got old because I love teaching people about privacy. But it's nice now that they're forced to remember. I'm not having to spot audit my employees to see if they're getting consent to recordings. So that's really nice that you can do that from that perspective now, like the system will do it for you. But the retention side is really important too. So your video conferencing policy really does overlap with other things at your company. So from my perspective, like having it be written is best. It helps you avoid problems, including legal problems, but it also helps you build like your brand and your culture. And that can help you be inclusive on video conferencing. I spent part of the pandemic working from a sibling's home where there was definitely lots of noise going on versus like my traditional setup doesn't have that problem. But because of video conferencing with headphones and with backgrounds, nobody knew the difference, right? I was able to give the same level of performance and, have sort of the same interaction with people that I typically had. So, having something to help build that for your employees so that they don't feel like, oh, like we have a cameras on policy, but what's going on behind me isn't appropriate for my job. Like you can help build inclusivity by creating sort of like a normal expectation that allows everybody to be treated equally.
Yeah, there are 2 points in there that I want to jump on, Marie. One is the camera on policy. That's one that we've talked to several companies that have said, hey, we want everyone in our company to have their camera on. We've had other companies say, people are doing different things, they're in different situations. We really don't care about that. But it does seem to be an issue that some companies feel very strongly about. And then the second point that I really want to sort of use as a jumping off point to transition a little bit is what you said about working from a different location. You said you're working from a sibling's home. One of the issues that can also be addressed in a video conferencing policy is the protection of confidential information. And I think this is something that a lot of companies are worried about. If their employees are working from home or working remotely, are they adequately protecting confidential information? And that has a lot of different aspects to it. But one of them relates to video conferencing, right? I mean, if you're sitting in a Starbucks and you're talking all about kind of what your new product is going to be or your company's financials, that could be a real problem for protecting your confidential information. And that's something that you can have in a policy, either a video conferencing policy or potentially a separate confidential information and trade secret policy. And that's how the way that we do it in our SixFifty handbook engine is we have a separate policy about confidential information. But I think that that's an issue that a lot of companies are wrestling with as they have employees now who are working from multiple locations, not just their office location, and are sometimes using their personal devices to do work. And so I think that could be a really difficult issue. Marie, what do you think are some steps that companies can take in this new work environment to protect their confidential information and maybe what's important about doing so?
Yeah, I think you really highlighted some of the real reasons that we need to make sure that we have thought through this and educated our employees about it. Because you really do, I think sometimes we don't even realize how much confidential information we're talking about on a daily basis. Like, we might think of some things like financials as confidential, but not necessarily thinking about like, if I'm on the HR side of the business and I'm talking about an employee, pretty much everything I'm saying is private information, right? Or, if we're talking about a product launch and I'm fixing a bug on the engineering team, it's all confidential. So it really is important to pretty much every team at your company to have an understanding of what they deal in that's confidential. And so I think it's a combination of having like your overarching policy, but also having team trainings to help your team members understand specifically what they're doing that could lead to confidentiality issues so that they can be extra aware about their own activities. And so, when everybody was mainly in their offices, a lot of companies had clean desk policies, because it's like, oh, we're aware of the fact that in the evenings, when you're going home, there's a whole other workforce that's coming in. The janitorial staff is coming in and taking care of the space for us. We need to make sure that we're protecting confidentiality by making, cleaning off the desk, so there's not confidential information just sitting out. Well, now you're at home, and it's easy to let your home accumulate maybe some things to take care of, and then getting it all done together. But if you don't have a clean desk at home and you have visitors in your home, they might be, just like this janitorial staff might have been at an office, they might be seeing confidential information that's out on your desk. Some people laugh when I say that, because they're like, who uses paper anymore? I'm like, well, the lawyers and the accountants still probably have some paper. But in addition to the desk, there's the devices. And so, if you have your work device, but you also have your toddler who is obsessed with devices, and you can't keep it out of her hands because she sees it and she takes it and you're looking for it, right? Granted, she probably can't read it, but you have to think about, have we incorporated two-factor authentication requirements for our employees who are accessing information on their personal devices or on devices we provide for them, but that are in their homes, not in our offices. So, what security have we put around it to help protect confidentiality? How have we trained our employees on what they do with their codes, right? Or if we still have anybody who's putting their password on the Post-it note and sticking on their computer is free game if it's in the home, right? Lots of people could find it. So having those trainings that follow up on the policy, I think, is a very important step to help educate your employees about what they're doing, why it could be dangerous for the company, and how they real practical steps they can take to follow the policies you put in place.
Yeah, and Marie, I love what you said, and I'm going to distill it down to sort of 2 points. The first one that I think is just critical is for companies to help their employees understand what is confidential information for that company, and what may be trade secrets, right? And Marie, I think you touched on this, but confidential information could go well beyond what most employees think it could be, right? I mean, it could be financials, but it could also be ideas for us, ideas for a new product, or plans that we have to expand certain things, or personnel information certainly should be confidential. But there's a whole range of company specific information that should be kept confidential to protect a company. And I think helping employees to understand what information needs to be kept confidential is step one. And then training them on how to keep it confidential. And you talked about two-factor authentication, and when you were talking about the home office, I kind of wondered if you had peeked your head into my home office and seen, it's easy to let your home office kind of get dirty and spread. But I do think that there's steps that companies really should be thinking about taking to protect their confidential information. And a lot of that is helping their employees know what the expectations are, right? When you're sharing your screen, for example, for a video conference, are you sharing your screen onto potentially emails from another company before you navigate to the screen that you meant to share? There are a whole bunch of ways that you can accidentally disclose confidential information. Are you having calls about confidential information while you're standing in line at Home Depot, or doing those kind of things? That can be problematic for your company. And so I do think it's important that you not only explain what confidential information is for your company, and that can vary from company to company, but also take steps to explain what you need your employees to do. And this may sound overwhelming or burdensome, but we have a confidential information and trade secrets policy in our handbook, and it's not that long, actually. It just describes what confidential information is, tells employees they need to be mindful of it, and that they should be careful when discussing it in public, and the way that they use their devices. It could be simple, but I think it's important.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I'll just put this out there to make everybody feel better about it. I know I'm not the only person who, in order to keep something confidential, has had to lock myself in a bathroom so that I knew that nobody else would be able to hear what I was saying. As we have more people working from remote spaces, you have to find solutions sometimes, and sometimes that's the solution. whatever it is you have to do, like help your employees understand and normalize it. Like that's another reason that, these backgrounds are great, right? Like I had to lock myself into the bathroom to take a call, but nobody knew that's where I was.
Well, Marie, I have to say that my go-to is the car in my driveway. And I sometimes wonder if my neighbors are wondering why I'm always walking out and sitting in the car. I've got 4 kids running around, and sometimes that's the only place that I feel like I can have a confidential call. So I understand that. Another part, yeah, sitting in that car in the driveway. Another aspect to this is the confidentiality provisions that can be in your employment agreement, right? We talked about it in the handbook, but those can also be in the employment agreement. And this may be a good time to transition to Adam's portion, talking about how employment agreements are affected by relocation and hybrid work situations.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So, we've talked a little bit about both about the benefits and the potential headaches, right, for having a remote workforce, especially in a tight labor market. It opens up a whole, new source of employees for your company, but it also subjects you to new legal requirements that can be really burdensome and hard to figure out, what you need to comply with. And so this is really important when it comes to the employment agreements that you're entering into with your employees, right? So employment agreements with provisions like non-disclosure agreements or arbitration provisions or non-compete agreements. Those are all, can be very state specific. And so before we jump into this topic in more detail, let's start out with a poll here. And so the question we have for you is, does your company currently use the same non-disclosure agreement, arbitration agreement, or non-compete agreement with employees in different states? And we'll give you a few seconds here to answer that, and then we will take a look at the results.
And if those are all, if the answer is like yes to one and no to one, I would suggest putting yes.
Yeah.
That's sort of the overall point of information I think we're most interested in here.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results there. Okay, so we have almost 70% of companies that are using the same form of agreements with employees located in different states, about 30% not. So I think that's a really interesting result. I think, and we'll talk about this here in a second, but as your employees are potentially very quickly dispersing to numerous states, the question for companies there is which states' laws apply to these employees that are located in different states. And I think that's one of the main questions that we're seeing from that we're getting from companies, right? And it's a really complicated question, right, about which states' employment laws are going to govern your relationship with your employees in different states. But there is, luckily, a sort of a general rule of thumb that you can go by, which is that the state where your employee is primarily located is going to be the state whose laws apply. And it can get really tricky if you have an employee that's working in different states. But if that's the case, if let's say you have an employee that's located primarily in Texas, but they do some incidental work, right? They travel, once a month for a few days to Oklahoma. Well, it's probably going to be Texas law that applies there because that's where they're primarily located. But again, it gets really tricky if you have an employee that's splitting work half time between 2 states. And so it may be a close question there, which state's laws you need to comply with. And I'm curious, Maria, as GC, what do you do in a case where it's not super clear which state's laws are going to apply, and it may be one or the other, and it's hard to tell?
Yeah, it really depends on the situation. What I try to do in those situations is make sure that what I'm putting into the agreements matches with the stricter state. So if I'm like, okay, it's one of these, I can do my test. I can figure out like it's going to be one of these states. Which state's the most restrictive? Let me make sure that I'm compliant with that state's requirements. So if that state, for example, requires me to, meet certain requirements when an employee has jury duty. This is on my mind because we just had an employee who had jury duty. Let me make sure that what I'm making available in terms of jury duty leave, meets the requirements of that stricter state. If it's the agreement itself, so that's more of like a policy, but it's the employment agreement itself. And I'm like, okay, one of these states restricts NDAs and the other one doesn't, I'm going to go with the idea that I can't have my general NDA for this employee that I might prefer to have. I need to follow the stricter one. So again,
Yeah.
like that's just sort of a general rule of thumb that you can follow to go with the other general rule. But that's where I start from.
Okay.
Sometimes if that's problematic, I then have to go to like the next level of review. And, hopefully I can do it without pulling in outside counsel. That's where I rely a lot on the tools that we have here at SixFifty. And sometimes though, right, at the end of the day, it's still a legal opinion of, it's a balancing test, and how I balance it might be a little bit different than how a judge decided to balance it.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And so, companies are sort of left with the question now, what does this mean? What does this mean for us, right? Where we have numerous states' laws that may apply to our different employees. And there's several areas of the law that we could talk about that really highlights this. I think today we may just have time to jump into one or two areas. Okay, let's move in and talk a little bit about non-disclosure agreements. We've talked about, Ryan addressed, confidentiality issues that arise when you have a remote workforce. And so, this is an area of the law that's changing very quickly. And there have, I think, historically sort of been two main areas of the two main ways that companies use non-disclosure agreements. One is, which we've talked about a lot today, is to protect company confidential information and company trade secrets. But there have been companies that have gone further than that and used them to prohibit employees from discussing things like unlawful workplace discrimination or harassment. And that's really, has been sort of a problematic use of non-disclosure agreements. And we've really seen this a lot recently, I think as a result of the Me Too movement, where it has been in the news a lot, examples of employers using NDAs to silence victims of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. And so I think because of that, the employers' use of NDAs have really, states have started taking a close look at them and started limiting the ways employers can use NDAs. And again, so this is now very state dependent, whereas, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, that may not have been the case, which, the result of that is you may have, different limitations on your use of NDAs for your employees in California than you do for your employees in Texas. So there are some states that have taken no action on this. There are really no limits on, or very few limits on the use of NDAs. Other states like California and Illinois generally prohibit NDAs that don't let employees discuss unlawful employment practices. There are other states like Tennessee and Virginia that have taken a more limited approach, and they place limits on employers' use of NDAs related only to sexual harassment. And so I think this sort of patchwork treatment between the states of NDAs raises really important questions for employers with employees in different states. So I think, Marie, this is a question for you. Just because a state may not have limits on an NDA, should a company have an NDA that is expansive as possible, right? Like, what do companies need to be thinking about if they have an NDA in place that would prohibit, for example, an employee from discussing workplace sexual harassment, for example? And then I think I'll ask a compound question. The follow-up would be, how important is it that employers have consistent policies between employees in different states? So if an employee, if a company has one employee in California and then another employee in Texas, should they, prohibit the Texas employee from disclosing facts about workplace discrimination, but not place those same prohibitions on the California employee?
Yeah, I think those are both great questions. I'll start by saying, as you make a decision about, whether to have the same policy for your employees across the board, I'm going to give that lawyer answer and say it depends. For example, because we're talking about NDAs, but it also, like, the same set of rules can apply to, say, non-competes. And so I want to make sure that I'm fostering positive company culture. So my perspective on this, and I know companies take different stances, but, at SixFifty, we've had a lot of discussion about, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, and issues that have surrounded, sexual harassment and disparate treatment. And so we've made a decision that, none of our NDAs will be enforced in situations in which the underlying subject matter, you can just facts about discrimination and harassment are not covered by our NDAs. Right. And so that's a decision you could make that would keep you in line with the majority of jurisdictions. There's still a couple, like Adam mentioned, where you might not be able to have, or you might have to expand it for some states where it'd be like, okay, but in these states, NDAs don't apply at all to any sort of illegal action, not just those ones that I've identified. So it's a combination of, there might be some company culture questions mixed in here with your legal requirements. So from the perspective of, can I have a patchwork? Yes, you can. But like Adam mentioned, this could mean that you will have a patchwork of results where you might have some things getting disclosed out of, some states that aren't getting disclosed out of others. And, as a general rule, most companies want to limit disclosure. So if the patchwork is the best you can do, because you're in some states with very limiting rules and you're like, but we're going to limit those other guys. You have to keep in mind, like, okay, but if those employees move, right, you now need a new agreement with that employee because your old agreement may not be valid in the new jurisdiction. So it also goes back to that conversation we had with Adrian, where it's like, okay, as you're considering relocation, you need to also look at the employment agreement, because if you're not using the same one across the board, you may have to renegotiate the employment agreement for the new jurisdiction. So if I answered your 2-part question, I think I did. My answer would be like, you have to decide, which things matter the most to the company, what your underlying decision is going to be based on. Some of that may be culture, some of it may like company culture, some of it may be, requirements based on where you are located. And if you have that patchwork, you just have to know that changes the way that you can treat other things like relocation. It also can impact your employees if they see that other employees are being treated differently. So, you're in one state, you get on a team with somebody in another state, and something comes up and they're talking about it together. And one employee is like, well, I don't know, because of this NDA, I don't know if I can report this. And the other employee is like, well, of course you can report it. What are you talking about? We don't have an NDA. Right. And then they realize like, oh, we're being treated differently. So that could create a new culture problem in and of itself. So it's a lot to think about as you make that decision.
Yeah. And there, in addition to NDAs, there are several other areas of the law that these issues arise. And one big one, which we don't have time to jump into today, are non-compete agreements, which are notoriously hard to enforce and very state specific. It's an area of the law that is moving really rapidly. I think, just this year, something like, 21 states have 66 pending non-compete bills, right, to try to limit employers' use of them. And there can be real consequences for employers that don't get the choice of law question right. So if you have an employee that moves to a different state and now you're subject to that state's non-compete laws, again, the consequences are real. So there are some states now that will impose civil penalties just for entering into unlawful non-compete agreements. So even if you don't try to enforce that, just by virtue of having entered into an unlawful employment agreement, you can be fined. Colorado just sort of made big news in the employment law world by criminalizing violations of their non-compete laws. So now employers that violate that law are potentially subject to misdemeanor criminal penalties as well. And so again, there are real life consequences for employers when it comes to getting complying with the right state's laws. And so, in this, again, employers are sort of left with the question, all right, well, what's the best course of action here? And I think this whole issue really highlights the importance of having a really strong relocation policy in place that Adrian talked about. But if you do have an employee that moves to a new state, whether you've approved that or you don't have a policy and they move, and you're now potentially subject to that state's laws, what's the best practice here? Do you have to enter in a new employment agreement with that employee? If you do you have to give them some additional consideration or benefit to support that agreement? Marie, I'm curious if you have any, I know we're running up against the hour here, but if you have any final thoughts on that.
I'll give a more direct answer than I've given on most questions instead of the legal one. I would say you can enter into a new employment agreement. And in the majority of states, my read is that the new allowing them to relocate would be consideration, because you don't have to let them do that. So by virtue of this new negotiation, if I want to move, I want to like change some of those terms of my employment, that it could be the consideration to change terms. With that, I think we will wrap up right here since we're on the hour. Thank you guys so much for all the information that you shared. I think the biggest takeaway for me from all of this is that, you know, as we move into a situation where we have more dispersed workforces, whether that's because they're remote, you're opening new offices maybe in these new states, or, you know, you're going hybrid. As our workforces grow, as they disperse, we have to be careful, right? We have to make sure that we're doing the right things, that we're checking the right boxes, and that we're protecting our employees and ourselves. And to do that, I think policies and procedures are very important. It's hard to overemphasize that. And so, of course, this is SixFifty. We do have tools in place to help you with that. If you want to go to 650.com/employment, you can see sort of that suite of tools that include your 50 state handbook solution, you know, your workplace policy solution, your option to do a la carte policies, but also these, you know, your NDAs, your non-competes that will ask you, okay, which states? Okay, based on the states that you select, we'll create a different set of questions, and this will generate for you these policies that would be compliant in those places. So it really can be a lot. I know it feels overwhelming when we talk about it, but you know, there are solutions that can help you, and there's also like so much value in, I can't overemphasize, you know, talking to your employees about your decisions, having the policies, communicating them, and then having follow-up so that if there are concerns, you can learn what they are, and maybe you can adapt your policies. We've changed policies over the last 2 years at our company based on employee feedback. And I think that's, again, talking about the need to keep your workforce engaged and happy as there's so much competition now. That is really a valuable tool as well. So any final words as we close from anybody on the panel?
No, this was a fun discussion. Thank you, Marie.
Okay, we'll see you guys all the next time.